Imagine a noise that cannot be confused with anything else. The roar of thousands of voices, the clatter of sandals on stone steps, the clang of metal, the smell of sweat, wine, and blood. You are standing at the entrance to the arena, in a dark corridor that the Romans called Porta Santa Vivaria, the gate of the living. Only those who survived the battle left from here. But today, this exit has become an entrance for those who know that they may not return. The corridor beneath the arena was cramped and stuffy. The stone walls reeked of blood and metal. Behind the heavy wooden doors, the crowd was already rumbling, impatiently demanding a spectacle. Perhaps Mark was wondering if it would all be over quickly, or if he was in for a long ordeal, stretched out with every blow. Perhaps he was remembering the faces of those he had lost and weighing whether one more death was worth living for. Imagine this situation, standing between the darkness of the dungeon and the light of the arena, knowing that in a few minutes you will either survive or become part of the dust that settles on the sand beneath the feet of the spectators. The cries from above merged into a single roar in which it was impossible to make out words. But the meaning was clear. They were waiting for blood. In front of the gate was a thick iron grate. Behind it was a light that hurt the eyes after the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, trumpets sounded, to be military horns that signaled the start of the battle. Trumpeters in red cloaks stood on platforms, so that the whole crowd could see them. The gladiator, once known as Marcus Aurelius Scævola, was silent. Not long ago, he was the son of a patrician and heir to a large estate. Now he was a slave in a ludus, a gladiator school. His body was covered with scars from swords and whips. His hands were rubbed raw. He wore a heavy helmet with a narrow slit for the eyes, a short sword called a gladius, and a large shield called a scutum. In this gear, he could fight for an hour, or die in a minute. Today, another test awaited him. That morning, his trainer whispered the condition: freedom in exchange for one kill. For the Romans, gladiatorial games were not just entertainment. They were a demonstration of the state's power and ability to control fear and death. Emperors used arenas as a political weapon to distract the people from taxes, crop failures, or war. Blood on the sand was part of the order. The arena smelled of dampness and sweat. The stone corridors of the carceres, where the fighters were kept before entering the arena, were narrow with low ceilings. Torches gave off a dim light, causing the helmets and blades of the weapons to flash with short sparks. Isolated cries broke through the roar of the crowd, impatient, sharp. Mark stood at the end of the row. Ahead of him were 5 gladiators, flanked by guards with short gladius swords, ready to intervene if anyone tried to escape. The order of exit was clear. First came the musicians, then the battle director, summa ludus, with a long stick to stop the fights. After him, pairs of fighters were led into the arena. Once you were under the gaze of the crowd, there was no way back. It was Mark's turn. His heart was pounding in his temples. The straps of his armor were so tight that it was difficult to breathe. The weapons were real, not training weapons. That meant one thing: someone would not return alive today. He stepped into the passageway and was hit by hot air. Fanfare sounded above his head, the gates creaked, and light flooded his eyes. The arena was oval, covered with yellow sand that had been watered to prevent dust from rising. Around the perimeter were high walls of the podium, behind which sat senators in white togas with purple stripes, wealthy matrons, and young people from noble families. Higher up were craftsmen, slaves, and merchants. At the very top, without awnings, huddled the poor and women. From the opposite gate, a thin figure in a worn tunic was led into the arena. At first, Mark saw only a silhouette against the sun. A few steps forward, and the face became clear. His heart pounded against his ribs so hard that he almost suffocated. He hoped it was a coincidence that it wasn't her. But it was her. His sister, Lydia. Imagine that moment. You are standing among thousands of roaring people, and you realize that in front of you is your own sister, sold, humiliated, and thrown to the wolves. She looked up, and that was enough for the rest of the world to disappear. Lydia wore a light helmet, carried a short spear, and a round shield. She moved confidently, but her shoulders were tense. Her hair was cut short. This was done to all female fighters, so that they could not be grabbed by their braids. Her eyes were dark, tired, with shadows that young girls do not have. Some said she had been trained for this battle for months. Others said she had accidentally ended up in his school. The truth was known only to those sitting in the boxes. Female gladiators, gladiatresses, were rare, but they were used for special spectacles. Their fights were sometimes a mockery, sometimes a calculated humiliation of the enemy. Pitting Lydia against Mark was not an accident, but a deliberate act of cruelty. The crowd demanded blood. Within these walls, there was no such thing as brother or sister, only the victor and the vanquished. In Rome, a slave's life was worth less than the cost of his helmet. Today, the price had been set. Either he would kill Lydia, or they would both die. Mark remembered the path that had led him here. The house with marble columns, his father, who had taught him to read the laws, the conspiracy that had taken everything away from him, friends who became enemies, a trial without the right to defend himself, his father's execution, his mother, who was taken away into the darkness, and Lydia, from whom he was separated at the slave market. Now, the arena, hot sand under his feet, and a crowd deciding who will live. To understand how Marcus ended up in the arena, we must go back several years to a place the Romans called ludus. It was not a school in the modern sense, but a barracks, prison, and training camp all in one. The day there began at dawn with a sharp cry of exsurgite. "Arise!" The wooden doors with heavy bolts were opened, and the guards led the fighters out to the training ground. Marcus was bought at a slave market in Capua, a city in southern Italy known for its large gladiator school. It was here, decades earlier, that Spartacus trained before raising his rebellion. The slave trade was commonplace in Capua. Prisoners, debtors, and those sold by their own relatives were brought here. At that time, Mark's body was young, without battle scars, but already exhausted by hunger and hard work. At Ludus Magnus, Rome's largest gladiator school, new recruits were immediately divided into groups according to strength and physique. The strongest were trained for combat in heavy armor, while the most agile were trained for quick skirmishes or one-on-one fights. No one explained the selection process. Orders were not to be questioned. Training began with wooden weapons to avoid accidental deaths. Then they moved on to metal. They practiced strikes, defense, and maneuvers, hundreds of repetitions. Any mistake was punished with a whip or restrictions on water and food. The body had to become as obedient as the emperor's sword. The fighters lived in stone rooms without windows, 10 to 12 to a room. Instead of beds, They had wooden planks and straw. They ate barley porridge, bread, beans, and drank water with vinegar. Meat was rare, mostly cheap offal. Paradoxically, gladiators were often obese, as this provided additional protection from blows. Skinny gladiators looked impressive, but did not live long. Mark quickly realized that the ludus broke not only the body, but also the will. There were no friends here in the usual sense. Anyone could become your enemy. At the same time, you couldn't survive without alliances. You had to share food, warn each other of danger, and make deals. Experienced fighters taught newcomers not only techniques, but also rules for survival. Don't argue with your trainer. Don't drink water before a fight. Don't look the emperor in the eye if he's in the stands. Female gladiators, like Lydia, were kept separately. They were trained more harshly, often not for real combat, but for entertainment. However, sometimes they fought to the death, especially when political games demanded it. For the Romans, the appearance of a woman in the arena was both shocking and entertaining. The arena could destroy any taboo. The fates of Marcus and Livia crossed again a few years after they were separated. He found out about it by accident. He heard from a slave from another school about a young female fighter who was being held in the dungeons, being prepared for special games. Her name was not mentioned, but the description matched the image he remembered. For Mark, this became both a burden and a hope. Time passed, and the day came when the Imperial Games were to feature an unusual match. Rumors spread among the fighters that someone was being forced to fight against their own blood. In Rome, this was not considered impossible. On the contrary, such fights were considered the pinnacle of spectacle. They were paid twice as much. The day before, Mark was summoned to the coach's room. There were 2 guards and a stranger in an expensive tunic. He did not introduce himself, but the ring with a golden eagle on a black stone revealed him to be one of his father's former allies. His words were short. "Kill her, and you will receive the ludus, the wooden sword of freedom. Refuse, and you die with her." In the ludus, death was a daily companion, but never before had it been measured so simply, one life in exchange for another. And now, the arena again. Hot sand under his feet, the sun beating down on his eyes, the crowd roaring. Lydia stands opposite him. Everything that had come before, years of slavery, training, separation, converged at this point. Mark stopped, and his gesture was immediately noticed. The spectators did not yet understand the reason, but the noise quickly grew to a roar. In such cases, the organizers acted without delay. A hand could rise in the box of the emperor or the main customer of the fight, and that meant the signal to begin. He did not move. His body remembered hundreds of training sessions, but now his muscles seemed to refuse to obey. Before him was not an enemy, but the only living blood left of their family. Suddenly, a gong sounded over the arena. In Rome, this meant the start of the fight. The spectators rose from their seats. Lydia took a step forward, clutching a short sword. Her gaze was steady, but deep in her eyes, Mark saw what he had once seen in his own reflection, fear intertwined with determination. The crowd demanded blood. In ancient Rome, such fights had a dual purpose: to entertain the public and to show that the authorities could force even relatives to fight to the death. You may be thinking, "I wouldn't do that." But there is no choice here. The referee's signal cut through the air. Lydia stood motionless, only gripping her sword more tightly. She knew what was expected of her. And he knew. Mark felt every step in the sand pulling him down, as if the arena itself was trying to drown him before the blow. He hoped she would drop her weapon, refuse to take part in this spectacle for the crowd. But the rules of gladiators left no room for refusal. Either you fight, or you are killed without a fight. Imagine that choice. In front of you is a person with whom you shared bread as a child, and around you thousands are roaring, waiting for blood. They don't care whose. They exchanged a few blows, mechanical, forced. There was no hatred, only a deafening silence between them, broken by the ringing of metal. Then came the moment when Mark realized either he did what was expected of him, or they would both be punished worse than death. They were approaching each other when another signal sounded from the organizer's box. A rare one. One that could change everything. But Mark didn't know what it meant yet. The crowd roared when a short, sharp blow sounded from the organizer's box on a bronze disc. It was not the usual signal for the start of the fight, but another, rare, but well known to experienced spectators. They recognized it immediately. Mutatio armorum, change of weapons. For the fighters, it meant one thing. They would be stripped of their usual weapons and forced to fight with something they were not used to using, or something that caused particular suffering. It was a favorite tactic when they wanted the fight to be slower, tougher, and the death more painful and spectacular. Two slaves ran out onto the sand. One snatched Mark's sword from his hand, the other took Lydia's weapon. Laughter and cheers rang out from the crowd. Instead, they were brought two heavy wooden clubs with iron-wrapped ends. They resembled training clubs, but were designed for real combat. A blow with one could shatter bones, crack a skull, or knock out teeth. It was a silent hint. Your death is to entertain the public, not to be a quick release. Mark felt the weight of the club, twice as heavy as his usual weapon. Lydia held hers with both hands, and even so, it was clear that she was barely able to handle its weight. But the real pressure began a moment later. At the edge of the arena, a platform rose from the sand. On it stood two gladiators in closed helmets, with spears and round shields. They were secutors, hunters trained to pursue and finish off those who were weak or fleeing. They stood to the side, not interfering. Their role was obvious. If the brother and sister refused to fight, they would finish the battle themselves, quickly and without mercy. Someone in the front row shouted, "Either him or her!" The crowd took up the words in a rhythmic chant that struck the nerves harder than any blow. Summa Ludus raised his club, giving the signal. Mark stepped forward, clenching his weapon. His gaze slid over Livia. She stood half-bent, but did not take her eyes off her brother. Both understood, if they did not raise their hands against each other, death would come from the side, and it would only take a few heartbeats. The deafening blow of the gong caused the crowd to explode with shouts. The game began. The crowd roared, shouts, whistles, and laughter rained down from the stands. No one wanted them to be saved. Everyone was waiting for the spectacle. They stood facing each other. Lydia wore a light leather and metal breastplate, her hair pulled back into a tight knot. Her gaze was steady, without a trace of fear. She raised her weapon, but did not rush into the attack. Mark forgot where he was for a moment. Another day flashed before his eyes, the courtyard of his family home in Ostia. His father sat on a bench, watching his son practice with a wooden sword. Livia, still a child, laughed when he fell, tripping over his own feet. The memory was interrupted by the loud roar of the crowd demanding blows. They closed in on each other, and their sticks met with a dull thud. A few exchanges of blows, more for the audience than for real harm. Lydia whispered, and he heard her through the din. "If you don't, they'll do worse." A tightness in his chest made him step back, missing her swing, which cut only the air. Another image flashed before his inner eye, a dark night, a banging on the door, his mother's screams. He was being beaten with sticks, his hands tied. Lydia was being dragged away, and that was the last thing he saw before long years of separation. A few more blows. Mark's shield slipped, the tip of the stick slid across his shoulder, leaving a hot trail of pain. Lydia did not finish him off. Her blows were accurate but not fatal. She was playing for time, trying to make him understand that there was no choice. "They won't let you go," she said again, dodging his swing. "It's better now." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the secutors moving behind her, heavily armed guards with tridents and nets. It was a signal. If the fight dragged on, they would intervene. One of them had already taken a step forward. Lydia lowered her weapon, looking tired for a moment. Mark understood that she had agreed. He still hesitated, but when he saw the guard raise his net, he took a step forward and struck. The tip of his club pierced the gap between the plates of the breastplate. Her body jerked, and the tension disappeared. Her eyes remained open, but they were lifeless. She fell silently onto the sand, as if the arena had swallowed her without pity. The roar of the crowd merged into a deafening hum. Mark stood over his sister, and the world around him seemed to lose all sound. The screams, whistles, and rumbling of the stands became a distant background. He looked at her face, at the light falling on it, and couldn't believe that just a few minutes ago she was breathing. Perhaps he was trying to memorize every feature. Perhaps he was simply afraid to look away, knowing that this was the last time he would see her. Some spectators shouted his name, others whistled, some laughed, but it all sounded as if through a thick layer of water. The secutors slowly approached to drag the body away. Mark took half a step back, but did not give way. His fingers turned white on the hilt of his weapon. Then he looked up at the platform where Lynchla sat, protected by guards. Their eyes met. The man smiled, holding a cup of wine, and Mark recognized him. It was the same man who had once given the order to take his family away. A cold confidence came over him. He gripped the club again with both hands. The guards were approaching, their iron nets clanging in the air. He knew that this battle could be his last. But now he had a goal. Mark abruptly changed direction, not toward the secutors, but straight toward the box of honor. The crowd did not yet realize what he was planning. The guards at the edge of the arena rushed forward, raising their short spears. A man in an expensive tunic with purple trim sat in the stands, a cup of wine in his hand. Gaius Valerius Lynchla, the man who had once brought guards to their home, signed the order to confiscate their property, arrest his father, and sell his children into slavery. The first spear whistled past. Mark dodged it, struck the guard's knee with his club, knocked the second one down with a blow to the ribs, and rushed forward. Sand poured from under his feet, and screams pierced his ears. Lynchla was no longer smiling. He sat upright, clutching the edge of his seat. His guards converged on the box, heavy shields, nets, tridents. One of the secutors stepped forward and took aim. Mark raised his club, and at that moment a heavy blow to the back of his head knocked him to his feet. The ground rushed upward. The net fell on top of him, trapping his shoulders and arms. He tried to get up, but a heavy boot pressed his shoulder blade into the sand. Iron flashed. A short, precise stab, under the collarbone, into the gap between the plates. His breath caught in his throat. The crowd erupted in a roar. The sand absorbed the blood, as it had done thousands of times before. Summa Rudis lowered his club. The fight was over. The guards dragged the body to the gate leading to the arena. Lynchlas took the cup again and sat down calmly, like a man who had just completed a long-planned task. In those days, the arena was not just a place of entertainment. It was an instrument of power, a command, a gesture, a signal, and lives changed in value. Rome knew how to make death a spectacle and suffering the norm. The laws allowed people to be turned into warnings. A brother killed his sister because order demanded it. Names disappeared in the noise of the stands, leaving only roles, the winner and the loser. The memory of people like Marcus and Livia does not wash away the cruelty. It only reminds us that where crowds become accustomed to blood, people cease to see other people.